Mud slicked the boots of every desperate man in Oakhaven, but the stench of cheap whiskey couldn't mask the bleakness of the auction block. She stood there, shivering a fragile frame, lost inside a frayed calico dress. 50 men laughed, placing loud bets on whether she'd even survive the wagon ride up the pass. Gideon didn't laugh. He stepped forward, dropped a heavy pouch of gold dust onto the barrel, and stared down the brutal crowd. What he told her next made the entire saloon go dead silent. Oakhaven was a town that felt like a mistake. It clung to the side of the Bitterroot Mountains like a tick composed entirely of rough-hewn, pine-deep mud and men who had run out of better places to go. Sadie Miller stood on an overturned apple crate in front of the assayer's office. The wind whipped down from the peaks, carrying the bitter promise of November snow, biting straight through her thin, faded calico dress. She was 22 years old, but the grey in her complexion and the sharp, bony angles of her shoulders made her look like a woman who had already lived a long, exhausted life. She held a balled-up, blood-spotted handkerchief to her mouth, stifling a wet, rattling cough. She was a debtor. Back in Chicago, they called them indentured workers. Out here in the West, they just called them cattle. The transport company had paid her train fare from the city with the promise of domestic work in a hotel. The hotel had burned down 3 days before she arrived. Now she owed the company $30, and the local magistrate was auctioning off the town's unclaimed women to settle their debts. A crowd of 50 men stood in the muck, passing clay jugs of liquor and spitting dark streams of tobacco juice into the puddles. They were miners mostly. A few loggers, men who needed someone to scrub their floors, boil their salt pork, and warm their beds through the freezing winter. "All right, boys," the auctioneer shouted, a fat man sweating through his wool suit despite the chill. "We got Sadie here. Good breeding hips, quiet mouth. 030 on her passage. Who's starting?" A heavy silence fell over the street, broken only by the howling wind and Sadie's muffled cough. The men looked at her with cold, calculating eyes. They didn't see a woman. They saw an investment, and she looked like a bad one. "I'll give you $5, shouted Jebediah Higgins, a fur trapper missing half his teeth. The auctioneer scowled. $5 don't even cover her train ticket, Jeb. She ain't gonna live to see snow melt. Jebediah fired back, drawing a harsh chorus of laughter from the crowd. "Look at her. She's spitting out her own lungs. I'm doing the county a favor taking the burial cost off your hands. $5, and she can haul my water until she drops." Sadie squeezed her eyes shut. She didn't cry. The factory floors of Chicago had beaten the tears out of her by the time she was 14. She just braced herself for the reality of her miserable life. She was going to die on a frozen mountain, working for a man who smelled like rotting meat. 50. The word cut through the wind and the laughter like a rifle shot. The crowd parted. A man stepped out of the shadows of the mercantile awning. He was massive, easily 6'4", with shoulders as wide as a blacksmith's anvil. He wore a coat of heavy cured elk hide, the fur collar framing a face that was weathered, bearded and etched with deep, quiet lines. His eyes were the color of slate. He didn't carry himself with the drunken swagger of the miners. He moved with the terrifying, silent grace of a rock slide waiting to happen. Gideon Cole walked up to the auctioneer's barrel. He didn't look at the crowd. He set a heavy leather pouch down on the wood. It hit with a solid, weighty thud. Jebediah bristled, stepping forward. "She ain't worth half that, mountaineer. You're throwing away good gold. She can't birth, she can't chop wood. She's a stiff wind away from a grave." Gideon slowly turned his head. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He just looked at Jebediah with a cold, dead stare that made the trapper take a slow, involuntary step backward. "Sold," the auctioneer stammered quickly, sweeping the gold pouch into his coat before the giant could change his mind. He turned to Sadie, grabbing her roughly by a frail arm. "All right, girl. Get off the block. You belong to the mountain man now. Do as he says, spread your legs when he tells you, and make sure his fire stays lit. Gideon's hand shot out. It was a blur of motion. His thick fingers clamped around the auctioneer's collar, lifting the fat man an inch off the mud. The auctioneer gasped, his eyes bulging as the wool of his suit bit into his windpipe. "Rule number 1, Gideon said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that carried over the dead silent crowd. He wasn't looking at the auctioneer. He was looking directly at Sadie. "You don't owe me a damn thing," Gideon told her, his slate eyes locking onto her wide, terrified gaze. "Not your body. Not your labor. You eat when you're hungry and you sleep when you're tired. You just survive." He released his grip. The auctioneer stumbled backward into the mud, gasping for air. Gideon turned his massive frame to face the crowd of men, his jaw set. "Anyone in this town tries to tell her different," Gideon said quietly, "you let me know." The street was dead silent. The miners exchanged baffled, uneasy glances. Men in Oakhaven bought women for labor and beds. They viewed them as plows or mules' tools to survive the bitter winters. This man had just paid $50, a small fortune, in gold dust for a dying girl, only to tell her she didn't have to work. They thought he was insane. Sadie just stood there, shivering, staring at the giant in the elk-hide coat. Her cynical mind raced, searching for the catch. Men didn't spend $50 on a sick orphan just to let her rest. Kindness was always a transaction. She knew that better than anyone. What is the hidden cost, she thought, clutching her worn carpet bag. What is he going to do to me when we get up that mountain? "Come on," Gideon said, turning away from the crowd. He didn't wait to see if she followed. He just expected it. Sadie stepped off the crate, her thin boots sinking into the freezing mud, and began to walk in the shadow of the mountain man. The first stop was the mercantile. Gideon didn't ask her if she needed anything. He took one look at her blue lips and her violently shaking hands, and he walked her straight into the dimly lit, wood-heated general store. The air inside smelled sharply of roasted coffee beans, oiled leather, and cured salt pork. He bought supplies with a brutal, efficient speed. A sack of flour, 20 pounds of sugar jars of preserved peaches coffee, and a heavy slab of bacon. Then he walked over to the back wall where the dry goods hung. He pulled down a thick, dark green wool coat. He grabbed a pair of heavy leather mittens lined with rabbit fur. Finally, he picked out a pair of sturdy, fleece-lined boots. He dropped them on the counter in front of the clerk. "Size 5 for the boots?" Gideon said. Sadie stood frozen near the doorway. I can't pay for these, mister. I don't have a single coin." "Didn't ask you to," Gideon replied without looking at her. He paid the clerk, gathered the clothing, and walked over to where she stood. He held the heavy wool coat out. "Put it on." She hesitated, her hands gripping her carpet bag so tightly her knuckles turned white. It was a beautiful coat, the kind of coat the factory foremen's wives wore back in Chicago. She felt unworthy of it. More than that, she felt terrified of the debt she was racking up. "Put it on Sadie," he repeated his tone, leaving no room for argument. She slipped her thin arms into the sleeves. The weight of the wool settled onto her shoulders, and the warmth was instantaneous. It felt like an armor she hadn't known she desperately needed. They walked out to the edge of town where Gideon's wagon was hitched. 2 massive, ugly mules stamped their hooves in the freezing mud. The wagon bed was already loaded with crates, tools, and thick canvas tarps. Gideon easily swung himself up onto the bench. He looked down at her. The step up was nearly 3 feet high. Sadie lifted her foot, tried to pull herself up, and felt her arms give out. She slipped back into the mud, humiliation burning her cheeks. Before she could scramble to try again, Gideon climbed back down. He placed his large, calloused hands around her waist. His grip was firm, strong enough to snap her in half, but surprisingly careful. He lifted her effortlessly, setting her onto the bench. He didn't say a word, just climbed back up beside her, took the reins, and clicked his tongue. The mules lurched forward, and the wagon began its slow, rattling ascent out of Oakhaven. The journey up the mountain was brutal. As they left the valley, the muddy road turned to hard-packed, frozen dirt, and eventually to snow. The elevation climbed, and the air grew thin and painfully cold. The wind howled through the dense stands of ancient pine, sounding like a dying animal. Sadie sat rigidly on the bench, clutching her small carpet bag to her chest. Inside was her entire life, a spare dress, a wooden comb, and her mother's worn Bible. The silence between them stretched for miles, thick and suffocating. In her experience, silence from men meant anger. It meant violence was brewing. She had to appease him. She had to show him she wasn't entirely useless. "I can cook," she blurts out, her voice raspy and desperate over the rattling wagon wheels. "I'm not much for heavy lifting yet, but I make a good stew. And I can mend clothes. I see your shirt has a tear at the shoulder. I can fix that tonight." Gideon kept his eyes fixed on the treacherous, winding road. "You don't need to sell yourself to me, Sadie. The auction's over." "But why did you buy me?" She asked, the words tearing from her throat before she could stop them. "You spent a fortune. You must want something." "You were freezing." She scoffed, a bitter, cynical sound that triggered a coughing fit. "Men don't buy women because they're cold." Gideon didn't answer. The wind picked up, cutting across the wagon box. Sadie's coughing grew worse. It was a deep, wet, rattling sound that tore at her ribs and left her gasping for the thin mountain air. She doubled over, pulling the wool coat tight around her chest, trying to muffle the sound. She expected him to yell at her. She expected him to slap the back of her head and tell her to shut up the way the orphanage matrons used to do. Instead, Gideon pulled back on the reins. "Whoa!" The wagon ground to a halt. Gideon climbed down, wrapping the reins around the brake lever. Sadie watched in a panic as he walked to the back of the wagon. "He's going to leave me here," she thought. "He realized I'm too sick, and he's going to leave me in the snow." He returned carrying a small iron kettle, a canteen, and a bundle of dry kindling. He knelt in the lee of the wagon, blocking the wind with his massive body, and quickly built a small fire. He poured water into the kettle, nested it into the flames, and waited. When it began to boil, he reached into a leather pouch on his belt, withdrew a handful of crushed, dried leaves, and dropped them into a tin cup. He poured the boiling water over the leaves. He stood up and handed her the steaming cup. "Drink?" Sadie took it with trembling hands. She brought it to her lips. It smelled like pine needles and damp earth. It tasted incredibly bitter, but as it slid down her throat, a soothing heat radiated through her chest. The sharp, tearing pain in her lungs dulled. Her coughing slowly subsided. She looked at him over the rim of the tin cup. "What is this mullein and slippery elm?" Gideon said, kicking dirt over the small fire to extinguish it. "Indians taught me. It won't cure you, but it'll stop the spasms so you can breathe." He took the empty cup from her, tossed it into the back of the wagon, and climbed back up onto the bench. He took the reins. He hadn't asked for a thank you. He hadn't touched her. He just did what was necessary to keep her alive, and then he kept driving. Sadie sat back, wrapping the coat tighter. She watched his profile as he navigated the treacherous mountain pass. He was a terrifying man, capable of immense violence. She had seen that in the way he handled the auctioneer. But the hands that held the reins were the same hands that had carefully brewed her tea. She closed her eyes, exhausted, confused, and for the first time in a very long time, entirely unsure of what the future held. They arrived just as the sun dipped behind the jagged, snow-capped peaks, plunging the mountain into a deep, bruising purple twilight. The cabin sat in a natural clearing, backed against a sheer rock face that protected it from the worst of the northern winds. It wasn't a crude shack. It was a fortress. The walls were constructed of peeled pine logs, thick as a man's waist, perfectly notched and chinked with hardened mud. The roof was heavy slate. Gideon stopped the wagon near the front door. He secured the mules and walked around to her side. Sadie tried to climb down on her own. She was determined to show some strength. She swung her legs over the side, but the cold had settled deep into her joints. As her boots hit the frozen ground, her knees buckled. Humiliation burned hotter than the cold. She hit the dirt hard, jarring her teeth. She scrambled to her hands and knees, terrified of looking weak. Weakness in the factories got you fired. Weakness on the streets got you killed. Gideon didn't laugh, and he didn't sigh in frustration. He simply stepped forward, caught her firmly by the upper arm, and hauled her to her feet. His face was a mask of practical assessment. "Let's get you inside before you freeze solid." He practically carried her through the heavy oak door. Inside it was a single massive room. A huge stone hearth dominated the far wall, flanked by stacks of dry cordwood. A heavy hand-carved oak table sat in the center with 2 chairs. In one corner there was a large, sturdy bed, piled high with furs and thick quilts. In the opposite corner, near the door, sat a much smaller, narrow cot. The place was immaculately clean. There was no dust, no grime. It smelled of ancient wood smoke, dried sage, and isolation. It was freezing inside, but it was perfectly dry. Gideon walked straight to the hearth. He grabbed a handful of shaved kindling, struck a match against the stone, and coaxed a flame to life. Within minutes, thick oak logs were crackling, and the desperate chill of the room began to break. Sadie stood awkwardly near the center of the room. Panic fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird. She needed to prove her worth. She needed to earn her place here before he realized he had made a terrible mistake. She saw a heavy cast-iron skillet resting on the edge of the dining table. She walked over to it, intending to clean it or put it away in the cupboards. Her hands were still completely numb from the journey. As she lifted the skillet, her fingers failed her. The heavy iron slipped. It hit the wooden floorboards with a deafening metallic clang that echoed off the log walls. Sadie flinches, throwing her arms over her head, shrinking backward until her spine hit the timber wall. She squeezed her eyes shut. I'm sorry, please, I'll clean it up, I'm sorry." She waited for the blow. She waited for the explosive anger, for the heavy hand to strike her across the face. Men were proud of their possessions. She had just dropped his cookware. She braced her muscles, holding her breath. Silence. Only the crackle of the fire filled the room. Trembling, Sadie slowly lowered her arms, peeking through her fingers. Gideon was standing by the hearth. He wasn't red-faced. His fists weren't clenched. His expression was unreadable, but his broad shoulders had dropped slightly, the tension leaving his frame. He walked over slowly, his heavy boots thudding softly against the floorboards. He didn't reach for her. He bent down, picked up the iron skillet, checked it for damage, and set it gently back on the table. "Sadie," he said. His voice was incredibly quiet, lacking any trace of the harshness she expected. She swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Yes, sir." "Don't call me sir. My name is Gideon." He pulled out one of the heavy oak chairs. "Sit down." She obeyed, immediately sliding into the chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide their shaking. Gideon leaned against the table, looking down at her. "You're waiting for me to hurt you," he stated. It wasn't a question. Men don't pay $50 for nothing. She whispered, her cynical defense mechanism flaring up. "I broke a plate once at the boarding house. The landlord took it out of my hide. I know how the world works. Maybe back east that's how it works." Gideon replied, turning his back to her to hook a heavy iron pot over the flames of the hearth. "Up here money is just dirt we pulled from the river. It ain't worth a human life. You drop a pan, you drop a pan. Iron doesn't bleed. You don't have to cower in my house." He let the pot heat up. It was leftover stew from a previous night. He ladled a massive portion into a deep tin bowl, grabbed a chunk of hard bread, and set the steaming meal on the table directly in front of her. Then he filled a smaller bowl for himself and sat down opposite her. "Eat," he said. She took a hesitant bite. It was a thick stew of venison root vegetables and heavily salted broth. It was rich hot and the best thing she had tasted in years. Starvation overtook her fear. She ate too fast, nearly choking before forcing herself to slow down. She kept her eyes darting toward him, expecting him to snatch the bowl away to tell her she had eaten her portion. He didn't even look at her. He just quietly ate his own food. When they finished, Gideon stood up and pointed to the large bed in the corner, the one piled high with thick furs. "You sleep there?" Sadie looked at the bed, then at the massive man. "Where do you sleep?" He pointed to the small, narrow cot situated right next to the heavy front door. She stared at him, utterly bewildered. The cynical armor she had worn for years was cracking, and it terrified her. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Are you a holy man? Some kind of saint looking for a stray dog to fix?" Gideon gathered the empty bowls. He paused, looking at her with those deep slate eyes. "I'm no Saint Sadie. I did things in the war that would turn your stomach. I'm just a man who prefers the quiet. And a house is too damn quiet when there's nobody else breathing in it." He walked over to the front door, sliding a heavy iron bar into place with a solid thunk. "Go to sleep," he said, blowing out the oil lamp on the table. "Tomorrow is a long day." Sadie lay down on the large bed. She didn't take off the wool coat. She pulled the heavy furs over her trembling body. The weight of them was immensely comforting. Outside, the mountain wind howled a vicious, violent sound that battered against the thick log walls. But inside, the fire crackled, casting a warm orange glow across the room. She watched the massive shadow of the mountain man as he settled onto the small cot by the door. He had deliberately placed himself between her and the outside world. For the first time in her adult life, she wasn't shivering from the cold, and she wasn't hiding from a beating. As her exhausted eyes finally drifted shut, Sadie realized that the brutal rules she had learned in the gutters of the city might not apply on this mountain. Morning arrived not with a gentle sunrise, but with a harsh, blinding glare that pierced the frost-thickened windows. Sadie woke to the rhythmic, echoing thud of an axe splitting wood. She sat up, the heavy furs pooling around her waist. Her breath plumed in the frigid air of the cabin. The fire had burned down to glowing red embers during the night. Gideon's narrow cot by the door was empty, the wool blanket folded with military precision. Her lungs ached a deep, hollow tightness that made every breath a conscious effort, but the paralyzing exhaustion from the auction block had retreated. For the first time in 3 years, she hadn't woken up to the screaming whistle of a foreman or the threat of a landlord's cane. The silence of the cabin was immense. It felt heavier than the noise of the city pressing against her ears. She threw off the furs, shivering violently, as the morning air bit through her thin dress. She spotted the green wool coat draped over the foot of the bed and pulled it on. It dwarfed her, but the lingering scent of wood smoke and pine trapped in the wool was grounding. Sadie didn't stay in bed. Survival in Chicago meant making yourself useful before someone decided you were a burden. She walked to the hearth, picked up the cast-iron poker, and stirred the embers. She fed handfuls of shaved kindling into the red coals, blowing gently until a flame caught. She piled on 3 split logs. By the time the front door opened, a roaring fire had pushed the chill back to the corners of the room. Gideon stepped inside carrying an armful of split oak. Snow dusted his broad shoulders and clung to his dark beard. He didn't look surprised to see her awake, nor did he praise her for tending the fire. He simply dumped the wood into the iron cradle beside the hearth and stomped the snow from his boots. "Water's frozen in the pump," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'll fetch ice from the creek to melt. There's a tin of oats in the pantry. You know how to make porridge." "I can make porridge," Sadie said quickly. "And biscuits, if there's baking powder." Gideon nodded once. "Pantry." He turned and left again. Sadie set to work. The pantry was a small, cold alcove lined with wooden shelves. It was stocked with a terrifying abundance of food. Sacks of flour, dried beans, hanging slabs of salt pork jars of preserved berries. It was enough to feed a family through a 10-month winter. She found the oats, the flour, and a crock of hardened butter. She worked with frantic, nervous energy. Her hands shook partly from the lingering cold, partly from the desperate need to prove her worth. When Gideon returned with a bucket of creek ice, she had a pot of oats boiling over the fire and a pan of irregular, lopsided biscuits baking in the heavy iron Dutch oven. They ate in silence. The oats were bland, and the biscuits were slightly charred on the bottom. Sadie kept her eyes fixed on her tin plate, chewing the burnt crust, waiting for the criticism. Landlord slapped you for burning flour. It was a waste of money. Gideon finished his bowl, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and reached for a second biscuit. He broke it open, ignoring the blackened bottom, and dropped a dollop of preserves onto the hot dough. "Oven heat's uneven," he stated, chewing slowly. "Back right corner is the hottest. Turn the pan next time." That was it. No yelling. No insults, just a fact. A tight knot in Sadie's chest began to loosen. She spent the rest of the day finding work. She couldn't chop wood or haul water, her arms were too weak, and the cough flared up violently whenever she exerted herself in the cold air, but she could mend. She found a leather pouch of sewing supplies in a drawer. She took Gideon's spare work shirts, the ones frayed at the collars and torn at the elbows, and sat by the fire. The rhythmic pull of the needle through fabric was a familiar comfort. It was a tangible, undeniable proof of her labor. When evening fell, Gideon sat at the heavy oak table, oiling the components of a Winchester rifle. He watched her from the corner of his eye. He saw the way she rigidly kept her spine straight, the way she rushed to stand up whenever he moved across the room. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop. "You don't need to earn your keep today, Sadie," he said quietly, sliding the bolt of the rifle back into place with a sharp metallic clack. She didn't look up from her stitching. "Idle hands starve. Not in my house," he replied. She stopped sewing. She looked at the giant of a man, his hands stained with gun oil. "No one buys a person out of charity. I'm waiting for the bill." Gideon set the rifle down. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. The firelight cast deep shadows over the brutal, weathered lines of his face. "I bought you because I watched 50 men look at you like you were a dying horse," Gideon said, his tone devoid of pity, just offering cold reality. "I bought you because I had the gold and they didn't. You owe me nothing. You want to sew my shirts? Fine, it helps. But if you spend the whole winter waiting for me to hit you, it's going to be a long, miserable winter for both of us." Sadie stared at him. The cynical wall she had built over 22 years of brutal survival cracked just a fraction more. She didn't say thank you. The words felt too small. She just lowered her head, picked up her needle, and kept sewing. Only this time her shoulders finally dropped. 2 weeks later, the sky turned the color of a bruised plum. The temperature plummeted so fast the log walls groaned and popped as the sap froze solid inside the timber. The wind didn't howl, it screamed. The blizzard hit with the force of an avalanche. Within hours, the snow drifted halfway up the cabin windows, plunging the interior into a perpetual gloomy twilight. The isolation was absolute. They were trapped in a single room, a tiny pocket of warmth, surrounded by a frozen, deadly ocean. Cabin fever gnawed at the edges of their sanity. The silence that had once been comforting now felt heavy and claustrophobic. But the storm brought a worse enemy than boredom. The drop in pressure and the bitter drafts seeping through the chinking triggered something dark in Sadie's lungs. What had been a dry, rattling cough morphed into a wet, agonizing bark. On the third day of the storm, she couldn't get out of bed. Gideon found her curled beneath the heavy furs, shivering so violently her teeth clattered together. Her skin was pale, but a dark, feverish flush burned high on her cheeks. When he touched her forehead, her skin was blazing hot. "Sadie," he said, shaking her shoulder. She groaned, batting his hand away weakly. "Got to get up." She mumbled, her eyes glassy and unfocused. "Foreman's gonna dock my pay. I have to punch the card." Delirium. Gideon didn't panic. Panic killed men faster than bullets. He moved with brutal efficiency. He stripped off his heavy coat, rolling up his sleeves. He dragged a chair next to the bed and set a bucket of snow down beside it. He spent the next 48 hours fighting a war against her own failing body. He brewed mullein tea so strong it was black, forcing it down her throat a spoonful at a time. When she coughed up blood-flecked phlegm, he wiped her mouth and made her drink more. He tore an old linen shirt into strips, dipped them in the melting snow, and pressed the freezing rags to her forehead, her neck and her wrists to break the fever. Through the worst of the night, Sadie screamed. The fever dragged her back to the slums of Chicago. She begged invisible landlords for more time. She cried for a mother who had died 10 years ago. She thrashed against the furs, fighting phantom hands. "Don't touch me!" she shrieked, kicking out blindly. "Leave me alone, I'll pay it!" Gideon caught her wrists. His massive hands enveloped her frail, bony forearms. He didn't hold her down aggressively, but with an immovable, grounding force. "Sadie," he commanded, his deep voice cutting through the noise of the screaming wind outside. "You're on the mountain. You're safe. Look at me." She gasped for air, her eyes wide with terror, staring blindly at the dark log ceiling. "Look at me," he repeated. Her gaze snapped to his. She saw the slate-grey eyes, the heavy brow, the exhaustion lining his face. The present slowly overrode the past. The terrifying grip of the memory broke, and she collapsed back into the mattress, sobbing weakly. Gideon didn't offer empty comforts. He didn't tell her everything would be fine. He just took the warm rag from her head, dipped a fresh one in the ice water, and laid it across her burning brow. "Sleep," he ordered softly. By the dawn of the 5th day, the wind died down. The oppressive roar of the storm was replaced by a ringing, deafening silence. Sadie woke up. The fever had broken. She felt hollowed out, weak as a newborn kitten, but her skin was cool, and her breathing, though shallow, was clear. She turned her head. Gideon was asleep in the wooden chair next to her bed. His chin rested on his chest. Dark circles bruised the skin beneath his eyes. He looked older, worn down by the long vigil. On the floor beside him were 3 empty buckets of water and a pile of damp, discarded linen strips. She realized with a jolt of clarity that this brutal, terrifying mountain man had stayed awake for 2 days to pull her back from the edge of the grave. She shifted her weight, the rustle of the furs loud in the quiet cabin. Gideon's eyes snapped open instantly. His hand twitched toward the knife on his belt before he registered where he was. He blinked, rubbing a hand roughly over his bearded face. He leaned forward, pressing the back of his hand to her cheek. His skin was rough, calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. "Fever's gone," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "You stayed up." Sadie whispered, her throat raw. Gideon leaned back in the chair, stretching his stiff shoulders. "I've buried enough people in my life, Sadie. I wasn't going to dig a grave in the frozen dirt if I could help it." She looked at the fire. "Who did you bury?" It was the first time she had dared to ask about his past. He could have ignored her. He could have told her to mind her business. Instead, he stared into the hearth, his expression hardening into something unreadable and bleak. "Men I fought beside," Gideon said quietly. "Men I fought against, Vicksburg, Antietam. I spent 4 years watching boys bleed out in the mud for politicians who slept in warm beds. When it was over, I couldn't look at a crowded street without smelling copper and rot." He stood up, picking up the bucket of dirty water. "I came up this mountain because the snow covers everything," he said, turning away from her. "Up here things only die because they're weak or they're careless, not because a man in a suit drew a line on a map." He walked out the front door to dump the water. Sadie watched him go. She finally understood. He hadn't bought her to be a slave. He had bought her because he couldn't stand by and watch the world crush someone the way the war had crushed the men he knew. They were both refugees hiding from a world that ate people alive. The thaw was deceptive. The sun glared down from a cloudless blue sky, turning the mountain into a brilliant, blinding sea of white. The snowpack was 10 feet deep, in places trapping them at the cabin, but the worst of the cold had broken. Sadie was sitting at the oak table shelling dried beans into an iron pot. She was still weak, her steps slow, but the grey pallor had completely vanished from her skin. For the first time in years, she had meat on her bones. The hollows of her cheeks had filled in. The wool coat wasn't a necessity inside the cabin anymore. Gideon was by the fire, sharpening a heavy hunting knife against a whetstone. The rhythmic shk of the steel was a peaceful domestic sound. Then the dog barked. It wasn't a friendly sound. It was the frantic, aggressive baying of a hunting hound. Gideon stopped. The cabin went dead silent. He set the knife down, stood up, and grabbed the Winchester rifle from the mantel in one fluid motion. He didn't look at Sadie, but his voice was a sharp crack of command. "Get in the pantry. Stay out of sight." Sadie didn't ask questions. Her street instincts flared. She dropped the beans, hurried into the dark alcove, and pulled the heavy wooden door shut, leaving only a crack to see through. A heavy fist pounded on the front oak door. It shook the timber. "Hello, the cabin!" A raw, gravelly voice yelled. Gideon checked the chamber of the rifle, thumbed the hammer back, and walked to the door. He didn't open it entirely. He threw the latch and pulled it back just enough to fill the frame with his massive body. Standing in the knee-deep snow were 2 men. They were exhausted, half-frozen, and looked like they hadn't bathed in a month. One of them held the leash of a vicious, emaciated hound. The other man pushed his way to the front. It was Jebediah Higgins, the trapper from the auction block. "Mountain Man." Jebediah sneered, his breath pluming in the cold air. He looked awful. His lips were cracked and bleeding, and a dark, frostbite stain crept up his left cheek. "Got caught on the ridge when the whiteout hit. Lost our pack mule. We need shelter." Gideon stared at him, his expression carved from stone. He hated Jebediah. He knew the kind of man he was. But out here, turning a man away after a blizzard was murder. The rules of the mountain demanded hospitality even to your enemies. "Drop your iron in the snow," Gideon commanded. "You don't bring guns into my house." Jebediah cursed under his breath, but unbuckled his gun belt, letting his revolver fall into the snowdrift. The other man did the same. Gideon stepped back, keeping the rifle lowered but ready. "Fire's warm. Don't touch anything." The 2 men stomped inside, bringing the foul stench of unwashed bodies, wet wool, and cheap tobacco into the clean cabin. They hurried to the hearth, practically shoving their hands into the flames. From the dark slit of the pantry door, Sadie watched them. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She remembered the cold, predatory look in Jebediah's eyes at the auction. He was the man who had bid $5 for her life, laughing about her burial cost. The cabin suddenly felt entirely too small. Jebediah turned his back to the fire, warming his rear. His rat-like eyes scanned the room, noting the neatly stacked firewood, the clean floor, and the pot of beans sitting on the table. "Cozy little setup you got here, mountaineer," Jebediah said, pulling a dirty rag from his pocket to wipe his running nose. "Didn't think you had it in you to keep house?" He paused, a cruel grin spreading across his face, exposing his rotted teeth. "Where's the cattle? The little sick bird you bought off the block? She dead yet?" Gideon's grip on the rifle tightened. His knuckles turned white. "Don't speak about her." Jebediah laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Don't tell me you actually kept her alive. Hell, man, $50 for a whore who can't even stand up. I bet she ain't even worth the trouble in bed." The heavy metallic clack of the Winchester's lever action echoed through the cabin like a thunderclap. Gideon had the barrel leveled directly at the bridge of Jebediah's nose. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't shouted. But the terrifying, violent stillness in his eyes made the other man freeze in terror. "I said," Gideon whispered, his voice vibrating with lethal intent, "don't speak about her." Tension thick enough to choke on filled the room. Jebediah swallowed hard, raising his hands slowly. The hound growled low in its throat. The door to the pantry creaked open. Gideon didn't take his eyes off Jebediah, but his jaw clenched. "Stay back, Sadie," he thought. But Sadie didn't stay back. She stepped out of the shadows. She wasn't wearing the oversized wool coat to hide herself anymore. She wore a simple, clean cotton dress. She stood taller than she had in Oakhaven. The mountain air and the food had given her strength, but it was the fire in her eyes that was new. She walked over to the table, perfectly calm, and picked up the heavy cast-iron skillet. She didn't cower behind Gideon. She walked right up to stand beside him. She looked Jebediah dead in the eyes. "I'm alive, Mr. Higgins." Sadie said, her voice steady and loud, entirely lacking the fearful tremor she had at the auction. "And this is my house. You will watch your mouth, or you can go back outside and freeze." Jebediah stared at her, utterly stunned. The frail, dying girl, coughing blood into a rag, was gone. In her place stood a woman holding an iron pan, like a weapon backed by a giant holding a rifle. Gideon didn't look at her, but a slow, grim smile touched the corner of his mouth beneath his beard. The cattle had grown teeth. "You heard the lady," Gideon said softly. "Sit down. Shut your mouth. And as soon as your boots thaw, you're off my mountain." The night stretched out like a drawn wire, humming with tension. Jebediah and his nameless companion slept on the hard floorboards near the hearth, their filthy wool coats pulled tight around their heads. The hound lay between them, twitching in its sleep, occasionally emitting a low, rumbling growl. Gideon did not sleep. He sat in the heavy oak chair at the head of the table. He didn't light the oil lamp. He just sat in the flickering, dying orange glow of the embers, the Winchester rifle resting across his thighs. His slate eyes never left the two shapes on the floor. He breathed through his nose, slow and silent, measuring the rise and fall of their chests. In the large bed across the room, Sadie lay awake. She stared at the ceiling timbers, her heart beating a steady, anxious rhythm against her ribs. She kept replaying the moment in her head. "This is my house." The words had bypassed her brain entirely, erupting from a deep, primal place she didn't know existed. For years she had been a ghost haunting other people's spaces, a factory floor, a boarding house cot, an auction block. She had never possessed a single patch of dirt. Yet, when Jebediah threatened this cabin, she had claimed it. She turned her head, slightly peering over the edge of the firs. Gideon's massive silhouette was carved against the dark. He was guarding her, not as a piece of property, but as a tenant of his sanctuary. When the first grey, anemic light of dawn bled through the frosted windows, Gideon stood up. The scrape of his chair was incredibly loud in the quiet cabin. Jebediah jerked awake, his hand instinctively flying to his empty hip where his revolver usually sat. He scrambled up his joints, popping his face, pale and slick with greasy sweat. The other man followed suit, grabbing the hound by its rope leash. "Boots are thawed," Gideon said. His voice was a flat, emotionless rasp. "Get out." Jebediah didn't argue. The terrifying stillness of the giant standing over him with a lever-action rifle suffocated his bravado. He grabbed his wet boots, shoving his freezing feet inside without bothering to lace them. He practically shoved his companion toward the thick oak door. Gideon threw the heavy iron latch. He pushed the door open. The biting morning wind swept in, carrying the scent of pine and raw cold. Jebediah stepped out onto the porch. He bent down, digging his frozen revolver out of the snowdrift where Gideon had forced him to drop it the day before. He checked the barrel, shaking the snow loose before sliding it into his holster. He looked back at the cabin. His eyes bypassed Gideon and locked onto Sadie, who was sitting up in the bed watching them leave. The sneer returned to Jebediah's cracked lips. The terror of the night was fading, replaced by the bitter, festering poison of a humiliated man. "Rich man's game playing house with a corpse." Jebediah spat his breath, pluming in the air. "Snow's gonna melt eventually, mountaineer. Dirt roads wash out. Men get hungry. You got a lot of gold up here, and only one rifle." Gideon didn't raise the weapon. He didn't need to. He took one slow, deliberate step onto the porch. The sheer physical mass of him eclipsed the morning sun. "If I see your shadow cross the tree line again, Higgins," Gideon said quietly, "I won't tell you to drop your iron." Jebediah spat a dark stream of tobacco juice onto the clean snow of the porch. He yanked the hound's leash and trudged away, his companion trailing close behind. They disappeared into the dense, dark timber of the lower trail. Gideon watched the tree line for a full 10 minutes before turning back. He walked inside, shut the door, and dropped the iron bar into place. He set the rifle on the table and leaned over the wash basin, splashing freezing water onto his face. He looked exhausted. Sadie swung her legs over the side of the bed. She walked over to the hearth and began feeding kindling into the embers. The fire caught, casting warm light back into the room. "I shouldn't have spoken," Sadie said quietly, keeping her eyes on the flames. "Yesterday, with the pan, I made him angry. I made a target of us." Gideon wiped his face with a rough towel. He looked at her back. He saw the way her spine was perfectly straight, bracing for a reprimand. "You didn't make him angry," Gideon replied, walking over to the table to begin breaking down the rifle for cleaning. "Men like Higgins are born angry. They hate anything they can't break. He saw you standing up and it made him feel small. That's on him." Sadie turned around. She gripped her hands together. "I called it my house. I didn't have the right. You bought the flour. You built the walls. I overstepped." Gideon stopped wiping down the rifle barrel. He looked up. His slate eyes met hers, and for the first time, the heavy guarded wall behind them seemed to lower an inch. "You defended it," Gideon said. "You didn't cower in the pantry. You stepped out and held the line." He tossed the oiled rag onto the table. "Wood and mud don't make a house, Sadie. The will to keep it standing does. You earned your share of the floorboards yesterday." Sadie swallowed hard. The cynical voice in her head, the one that told her she was just a squatter waiting for an eviction notice, finally went completely silent. She nodded once, turning back to the fire. They didn't speak of it again, but as the winter slowly began to break outside, the ice inside the cabin had completely thawed. The false spring hit hard. 10-foot snowdrifts collapsed into slush, turning the mountain into a treacherous slide of wet earth. The creeks, frozen solid for months, roared to life. Gideon stood knee-deep in the freezing, rushing water of the main gorge, swinging a heavy logging axe to clear a deadfall of ancient pines. If the natural dam burst, the floodwater would sweep straight through the cabin clearing. The roar of the creek was deafening. He never heard the hound. A heavy, mud-caked boot kicked the back of his knee. Gideon slipped on the slick river stones, crashing down into the icy current. He hauled himself up water pouring from his clothes to find 3 men standing on the embankment above him. Jebediah Higgins stood in the center, a rusted Walker Colt leveled directly at Gideon's chest. To his left was the companion from the blizzard holding a vicious, emaciated hound by a leather strap. To his right stood a heavy-set drifter with a double-barreled shotgun. "Roads washed out, mountaineer," Jebediah yelled over the rushing water, flashing a rotted smile. "Town's starving. We're taking your gold. Then we're taking the girl down to the mining camps." Gideon didn't negotiate. He didn't beg. He lunged. He drove his boots into the river stones, launching his massive frame up the slick embankment. Jebediah's eyes went wide. He fired. The flat crack of the Colt echoed off the gorge walls. The lead ball tore through the meat of Gideon's left shoulder, spraying blood across the slush. But the giant didn't stop. He slammed into Jebediah like a rock slide. They crashed backward into the mud. Gideon clamped his calloused hands around Jebediah's throat, driving his thumbs into the trapper's windpipe to crush the life out of him. But the companion dropped the leash. The starving hound lunged, clamping its jaws deep into Gideon's right forearm. Muscle tore. Gideon grunted, his grip breaking. The drifter stepped up, raising the heavy shotgun to cave Gideon's skull in. A thunderous explosion shattered the noise of the creek. It wasn't the shotgun. The drifter shrieked, dropping his weapon as his leg buckled in a red mist. Gideon threw the dog off and whipped his head around. Standing 50 yards away at the edge of the tree line was Sadie. Her dress was plastered to her legs by the wet brush. She held Gideon's heavy Winchester rifle pressed tight against her shoulder. She didn't shout a warning. She simply cranked the lever back, ejected the smoking brass, and aimed again. The companion took one look at her unblinking eyes and sprinted blindly into the timber. Jebediah scrambled backward through the mud, lunging for his dropped Colt. "Fire!" Gideon roared. Sadie pulled the trigger. The bullet slammed into the mud an inch from Jebediah's reaching hand. He froze, staring up at the rifle barrel, then down at the bleeding giant rising beside him. Gideon drove his heavy boot squarely into Jebediah's ribs. Bone cracked like dry kindling. Jebediah collapsed into a pathetic, wheezing ball. "Take your friend." Gideon rasped, his left arm hanging uselessly, blood pouring